black people in this country. Okay, he is going to do a presentation on ancient Lemuria, okay, on some discoveries that he has found in his travels from Tokyo back into the United States and the Pacific Ocean. And so once again, I'd like to say that we're very honored to have this gentleman present to us some of his data coming from his research, which we are privileged to hear. So if I could get you all to give them a warm welcome. I just want to say we have the magazine, and he has some of the magazines too, so if anybody has any interest, let us know.
Thanks. Thank you, Uma. And it's a real privilege and an honor to be able to make my presentation to you today, because I feel that I am a student. I don't try to portray myself as an expert in anything. I'm not a professional archaeologist. My background, as Uma said, is in journalism. So it's my job to be able to take this vital, important information that's really vital for all of our people, and to try to make it accessible and understandable, put it in everyday language, and that's what our magazine is about. What I want to talk to you about today is the lost history of black Americans. I'm talking not only about the blacks that are here north of the Rio Grande, but through our entire American continents, north and south. It started for me when I traveled through Mexico about 11 years ago. And I went to a place called Tres Zapotes, or the Three Shoes, which is on the Atlantic coast of Mexico. And there I saw, in a museum, this magnificent sculpture of a stone head, 9 feet tall, weighs 40 tons. Magnificently done, of obviously a black African, portrayed in a kind of a helmet or a crown. I learned that there were about 18 or 19 of these which were found all along the coast of Mexico, and that they were all reliably dated to 1,200 years before Christ. In other words, 3,200 years ago. They belong to a civilization called the Olmecs.
That's according to the literature of the black experience here.
Why do you need the word Negro?
That's a word meaning
The black living south of the Sahara Desert in Africa.
and these are not Negroes. But here again,
You remember the Black Madonna?
and the Madonna in Child, what you see here,
This is strictly Olmec, out of the Veracruz state region in Mexico.
so, and the Olmec is the modern civilization of all of the Americas. Now from the Fulcrums of Change, and then the Popol Vuh, we take it back to the heart, to the real creation story. So you know that America, the name America is a indigenous word, a Mayan word, meaning paradise.
Great head, I thought, well, this couldn't possibly be a black American, but it looks like it. Then I investigated the others. I saw the others that are written. They also portrayed different black Americans, some with full features, some with thinner ones, different individuals. And yet the archaeologists tell us that no, there was no one over here from either Africa or Europe or Asia before Columbus. That is what I was told when I went to school, and it's what the archaeologists and what the establishment teachers still tell people, that there was no contact between the Americas and the ancient world before Columbus. I found that beyond this collection of these great stone heads that belong to this Olmec civilization, that there was a lot more information which is not getting out to the general public about this previous black civilization. It was a black civilization that was here. Now, to give you an idea when this civilization flourished 3,200 years ago, what was going on in the rest of the world at that time? Well, there was no Europe. There was only part of Greece. Troy was the big, powerful city at the time. There was no Rome. Egypt was a great power. There was a power going on in China. But more importantly for our discussion here, there was also a great power here in the Americas. We call it Olmec, the civilization, the first known civilization. It means rubber, and it refers to a great ball which these people used to make for a sacred ball game.
Then they saw Rat.
What?
They seized him, squeezed him, and burned his tail. They made Rat's eyes bulge, and his tail have no hair.
Wait a minute, don't kill me, don't kill me. And it's not your calling to plant the cornfield.
What are you telling us?
I'll tell you right away, but, first give me a little something to eat.
We'll feed you later.
All right. Your calling is the same as your father's 1 hunter and 7 hunter who died in Xibalba when they went down there to play ball. You are ball players.
Well, the twins were so happy to hear that they were ball players and not farmers, they rewarded Rat. Long time ago, before the time of Christ, the people, the Maya people of Guatemala and Mexico, told a story of the creation, of the birth of the sun and the moon, and of the sowing of the first corn. It's known as the Popol Vuh of the Kichimaya.
Term which archaeologists use just to identify these people. They don't know what they were called. Now, if it was only those stone heads, figure, well, maybe it's coincidence or something. But about 1920, a Polish anthropologist was doing work in Yucatan, right in Tres Zapotes, and he found the remains of several burials of black people that dated back before Columbus in this very same area. On top of that, throughout the rest of this century, smaller sculpture has been found in the Olmec area, definitely portraying black people and related to this first civilization. Now, when these great black heads were first found in 1862, the Mexican, the European, and the American archaeologists said, well, these were just happened to be slaves who were blown overseas and they made statues of them. But yet the local people there, the native people, referred to those as black kings, sometimes as African kings. Also, if you have a slave, you're not going to create this huge, magnificent monument to someone that's the lowest part of society. You only create giant monuments to your most important people in society. On top of that, all of these great heads that were found were not just laying out in the open. They had been ritually buried with reverence, which means that they probably were great monuments at one time, and that there was a period of mourning, and then they were ritually buried, sort of you interred the greatness of this person. To give you an idea how magnificent these stone heads are, I should mention one thing before I forget, too. The archaeologists say, oh, no, they don't represent black Americans, black Africans at all. They represent a kind of Indians, but they resemble, as you'll see in the slides here tonight, nothing resembling Native American Indians. On top of that, they are all crafted out of black basalt. They're not, in other words, the basalt was chosen specifically to represent a black person, someone with black skin. They weigh 40 tons, and they were quarried in a mountain area that was 50 miles away, quarried there and sculpted there, beautifully sculpted, and then transported more than 50 miles to the capital of the Olmec civilization. Well, that's why he can sit there, that's all right. That'd be the same thing today as if you went, say, out to Gainesville, Georgia, found a boulder, crafted it perfectly, and by hand were able to transport it, this 90-ton work, all the way to the downtown Atlanta area. So whoever did this, they were obviously a great people with social organization on the same par of their artistic achievement. This is by no means the end for evidence of blacks in the Americas. A mound a ceremonial mound was opened in the year 1901 in northern Wisconsin, outside of the Apostle Islands. Now that's extreme north part of Wisconsin, right on the upper Great Lakes. When this mound was opened in 1901, the bones did not look Native American, and the skulls especially did not look Native Americans. Native Americans, you can tell almost at a glance that they are Native American skulls because the teeth, they meet, the upper and lower jaws. They have either no overbite or very little overbite. These jaws had pronounced overbite. So when the archaeologists found these skulls, they began to think, well, who do these people represent? So from that overbite, they investigated the rest of the jaw structure, the cheekbone structure, the periantals, this area up here, and unquestionably, they belong to black people. Now, to be interred in a mound was a sign of honor. The average person in the Native American cultures in Wisconsin, when they died, they were usually buried under the floorboards of the house. It went down further and further. You kept the family literally in your domicile, or else if they were common people, workers and so on, they were just buried anonymously in Potter's Field. The mounds were reserved exclusively for regents, kings, shamans, priests, the movers and shakers of society. These 4 black men that were found in this mound were laid out respectfully with copper goods. Now there's a key there. What were these ancient blacks doing up in northern Wisconsin more than 1,000 years ago? And why with copper goods? The upper Great Lakes of our country forms the richest deposits of copper on Earth. Among the largest, but more importantly, the richest, the highest grade copper. It appears that these black Africans were in the upper Great Lakes mining that copper. We do know, for example, that the upper Great Lakes area was the scene of a massive, complex, highly sophisticated copper mining operation. It was so complex that whoever these ancient people were, they dug a trench 5 miles long, were able to drill 60 feet through solid rock to remove this high-grade copper, and they were able to remove, while they were working up there, an astounding 500 million pounds of copper. Now, the Native American Indians, they used copper, what was known as float copper. They'd pick it up off the ground, and they'd make it into bracelets and so on. They didn't use much of it. Somebody was involved in making huge amounts of copper mining. Now, who could that have been? Well, if you look on the other side of the world, there were black kingdoms in West Africa, some of them known as Ghana and Mali. And if you study those cultures, and a lot's known about them because they lasted all the way to about 1400 AD, when the Arabs came in. These people were great goldsmiths, great metallurgists. They used lots of copper. Now, what's interesting, folks, is in that area of Africa, there are not many great deposits of copper. Where did they get all this wonderful copper? It's also known that these Africans were tremendous seafarers. They had things known as power canoes, in which there were 60 men manning these canoes. Then, on the other side of the United States, in California, you had a black tribe. And I will show you a drawing that was made from life, a beautiful illustration from life, of a man decked out in a kind of an Indian getup, but he's definitely not an Indian. He is a black person. What are we to make of all this? These wonderful comparisons. First of all, there is no doubt whatsoever, regardless of what the establishment archaeologists say, that there were sizable numbers of black people in the Americas, and they were not slaves blown out overseas by mistake. They actually had come here for specific economic and cultural purposes. They raised kingdoms here. Let me just quote from my notes. I don't like to normally do that, but there's so much information here. My brain is so small, I can't get all this stuff down. One of the things that's interesting is that there was a 16th century historian. His name was Peter Martyr. This was a man who was with the Spanish expeditions to Mexico. He was an eyewitness to the Spanish conquest. And in his chronicles, he writes exactly what happened. And Peter Martyr, who accompanied Balboa, you know, the guy that was looking for the Fountain of Youth through Florida, they actually saw native blacks in Florida in the year 1513. There was also a priest by the name of Gregoria Garcia. He said that there were blacks on an island north of Colombia, again in the 16th century, and that the people in Panama referred to a Negro king or a black king who had just recently died. Garcia's associate, his name was Bartholomew Las Cosas. He reported blacks in Florida. They even wrote down the names of these black tribes. The black tribes were known as the Jamasi of Florida, the Caribes of St. Vincent, and the Chirusas of Brazil. And they were regarded as indigenous black people. In other words, they were there before the Spanish arrived. When the Spanish arrived, they just immediately enslaved them, those that survived the diseases that were introduced by the Spaniards. So very little of what is known about them beyond these reports exists today. Now, since this information has come out, there has been great strides made in DNA. You're all familiar with the O.J. Simpson trial, how they can get blood types down. And in this DNA research, anthropologists, archaeologists, using computers, have been able to trace the different races that inhabited the Americas before the Spaniards arrived. One of the groups they've traced definitely are Mongoloid. They came across the Bering Straits. Now, these terms that I'm using have no social bearing. So when I say Negro or Negroid, it's the same I'm using Caucasoid or Mongoloid. These are scientific terms to identify people. I'm not talking in social terms. The people that came across the Bering Straits, we know about, okay, were Mongoloid. Definitely became the Indians and so on. At least two black strains, pre-Columbian they call them, before Columbus here, existed in America. One of those strains, those black strains, is unequivocally traced back to West Africa. This is revealed in some of the sculpture, the Olmec sculpture, which shows some of the blacks with a peripheral ridge, barely perceptible, a peripheral ridge around the lips. That is traced to a genetic type found in Ghana. It shows you also how excellent the artist was in portraying a real-life person. However, there is another black group, a pre-Columbian black group in the Americas, mostly along the west coast, California, what is now Acapulco, of a black group of people who do not trace their ancestry to Africa. No one can understand where these people have come from. None of them survive anymore. They do not exist. They have been either bred out of existence or they were the victims of disease or whatever. However, with this new DNA testing, which is now, in other words, all the DNA of every group in the world is now fed into a computer. A computer then can make correspondences, comparisons between every other group. This black group, which they found traces of in the Americas, matches, strangely enough, with Micronesia on the other side of the Pacific to a people called the Negritos. These are black people who trace their origins not east from Africa, but westwards across the Pacific. Now that leaves a tremendous problem. How is it possible that these Negritos, or their ancestors, could have possibly come across the vast expanse of the Pacific to come here? Moreover, there's a real cultural problem. The blacks that were here in the Americas were great builders of civilization. They were part of this Olmec culture. There's no doubt they were highly sophisticated. They had writing, they had astronomy, they had calendrics, they had a highly advanced system of religion. The Negritos, on the other hand, in Micronesia, are not civilized. They are not sophisticated. They are very low-level society. They are like Stone Age or pre-Stone Age people. Genetically, they're the same as these highly advanced people. But culturally, there's a huge difference. So, for the past few years, archaeologists could not figure out what's going on. Now, to jump to something which the archaeologists, it's a real buzzword. It's like the worst thing in the world you can say to them. Some people have suggested that there was, at one time, a great civilization in the Pacific called Mu, or Lemuria. Well, that's probably the worst thing you can say to an archaeologist because they regard it as total fantasy, totally made-up nonsense. And I sympathize with them because for many years, I didn't believe that such a place could possibly have existed either. Enough is known at the bottom of the Pacific to show there was never a continent there. However, with the end of the Cold War, something very interesting happened. When the Soviet Union was alive and well, or alive anyway, and in big competition with the United States, the Russians and the Americans were busily mapping the bottoms of the sea, you know, to fight each other's submarines and so on. So they made these highly detailed maps of the bottom of the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. Well, when Russia collapsed, the Cold War was over with, and there was no need to keep this privileged information anymore. So Scripps Oceanographic, out in San Jose, California, released these maps to the general public, which means now that you can actually own these tremendously detailed maps of the bottom of the sea. And what they revealed was extremely interesting. In the Pacific, we now know, and I will show you on the reproduction of this map, there is not a sunken continent, but there is a sunken archipelago, which is almost as big. An archipelago, for those of you that are not familiar with it, is like a string of islands, dry islands, very closely related, and their base underwater is all contiguous. It's all related together. What these maps reveal are a series of huge archipelagos which are in shallow water and which oceanographers know sank very recently. So recently, they could have been occupied by human beings. So right away we thought, well, there's a candidate for Mu or Lemuria, but still doesn't prove anything. It's interesting, but this really existed. Then in summer, last year only, some divers off the coast of Okinawa, South Japan, by accident, made one of the most fabulous discoveries ever. They found an underwater stone city, a magnificent city that stretches over 300 miles. It is from 100 feet to 20 feet below the surface, which means it's within sport diving range. It has been seen by hundreds of divers. It's been broadcast all over Japan and Europe. And what this city reveals is fabulous. It's hardly able to grok it. It's in great shape. It hasn't been destroyed by some cataclysm like a volcano or something. Either the water rose suddenly somehow, the sea level rose, or some volcanic plate dropped. No one knows how exactly. But this city is made up of an enormous 560-foot long pyramid. It's not like a pyramid you see in Egypt. It's like a temple based upon other temples in a pyramidal form. You go further north, and there are these great avenues, boulevards, and streets, steps, archways. I'll show you the photographs now. I have some of the shots of this. And more sites are being found. First there was one site found, then there were 3 more. Now 8 different areas of this have been found over a 300-mile area. And that area of Okinawa is part of this great archipelago that sank, the very extreme Asian end of it. And as underwater explorers continue, hopefully, almost for sure, they're going to find more of these. Now, is this Lemuria under the water? Well, if it isn't, I don't know what else it could possibly be. Now, it looks as though there is real physical evidence for this great civilization that flourished at one time. I can say, too, that these buildings that are found underwater bear virtually no resemblance to anything in Japan. A little bit, but very, very little. They mostly resemble, strangely enough, structures you see on the west coast of the Americas. There's a real comparison between some of the things which I saw and photographed in Peru with which we have photographs underwater in Japan. So the theory, and a very plausible one, a very workable one, is that there was a Mu, or Lemuria. By the way, that name recurs all through Asia. It recurs all through the Americas, where and Native Americans as well talk about their ancestors coming from this place which they refer to as Mu, or variants of the name Mu. For example, there's a great city on the coast of Peru, and they call that Chanchan. It belonged to a people who call themselves the Chimu. And on this, I've seen this place myself. It's available to anybody that goes there. On the walls of the city that belonged to the Chimu, which has just been unearthed from the desert, by the way. They've only seen the tops of it for years, and now archaeologists are brushing away the desert. And they revealed a very long mural on the side of a wall which they call the Palace of the Governor, just as a name to tag on. And along the side of this wall, it appears to depict the different history of these people. And part of this long wall shows a series of pyramids underwater with fish swimming over the top. So the basic theory is this, if you put all the myths and everything together, that here was this great island empire, more than an island, almost a continent, which we do know really existed, which still exists, very shallow water. And on this island, mankind, it looks like, evolved more than just civilization, but developed races, specific races. And when this land began to suffer from some geologic catastrophe, began to sink, the people left. And they took all their high technology, their high spirituality, and their culture, and they came, many of them, to the Americas. Relatively few, for one reason or another, went out to what is now Melanesia. And the conditions there are very rough, very hard. And over years, over the time, the generations, the blacks there, they lost their civilization, just in a fight for survival, and they got lower and lower. Whereas the blacks that went to Mexico found an environment far more conducive. The Valley of Mexico, you can do a lot of planning there. There they developed civilization, and it rose very high. What's interesting, too, is that in the past, only the past year, a number of skeletal remains have been found all along the West Coast also of white people that date back over 9,000 years ago. These bones were first found, and the Indians grabbed them from their own and said, oh, we're going to rebury them because they are our ancestors. And the archaeologists looked at them and said, well, that means your ancestors must be white because these bones belong to white men. Then when they did a study of these white bones, these white skulls, they found these were not white Europeans. These were whites that did not come from Europe. Their DNA traced to the Pacific also. So it looks as though this land of Mu or Lemuria evolved at least two different races. And when this island civilization declined and sank into the sea, some of them went north, some of the whites went north, and many of the blacks went into the Valley of Mexico and created what we know as the Olmec civilization. Now, why is all this important? And is it just all neat, or is it just exciting? For myself, it's exciting enough. But history, and this history is very important because it's suppressed. It's not common currency. You go to the colleges or the universities, they will still tell you there's nobody here before Columbus. Well, why is that? Well, an archaeologist, as I mentioned to some of the people here before the talk, archaeologists don't make much money. They can make money if they teach. And what they do, the archaeologist, he makes a name for himself in the field with the idea that eventually he'll go on to the university and he'll have tenure there. Well, then when you get to be a professor, what do? You write a textbook, right? And in the textbook, this is your authority, and means all your students and all your classes have to buy that textbook, right? And if it goes on, you've got this income. So then, in this textbook, you make sure you don't offend any of the powers that be, make sure you got your place there. So sure, only Columbus was here. Then somebody comes along and says, well, look at all these black people that are there. Oh, no, that's impossible. No, couldn't possibly be there. He doesn't dare admit that because his textbook would be outdated. He'd have to get rid of his textbook. Nobody would buy his textbook anymore. His main source of revenue is over with. But it's a lie nonetheless. Too bad. It's a lie. Black people were disenthralled. They lost their slavery status. True. Physically, that's over with. But if you raise generation upon generation in which you tell your people, in America, your only heritage here is slavery. That's it. The white people, they had kings and queens and all that stuff, but we only came from... That is a form of psychological slavery still. It's a form of psychological bondage. And I tell you what, myself, I would rather be a physical slave than a psychological slave. I can rebel against physical slavery. Psychological slavery, that'll really mess you up. So, it is vitally important that this information is made available. This is how you disenthrall yourself. This is how you find real respect when you say, okay, yes, slavery was part of our culture. It really happened, but that's not all. And we had people building civilizations here, not only before Columbus was born, but before Spain was born. We had great societies rising here. then you develop a real sense of self-respect and real connectedness with the land. Now, why is it important to me? That's because it's part of my heritage, too. I'm an American, too. And these people that are suppressing this thing about the blacks are also suppressing the thing about Asians being here, and there were definitely Asians that came here, and Vikings and everything else. This is, America apparently was a melting pot long before the Statue of Liberty came around. The other lesson to be learned from it, and this is vital. Look what happened when the Spaniards came here. They exterminated everybody. They enslaved everybody. They coughed on everybody and gave everybody diseases, wiped everybody out. That's the kind of heritage that they did. All these previous great civilizations, we don't know anything about them because they scrubbed them clean. That's what, and we're just picking up the pieces now. And it was hardly any better when the Anglo-Saxons came to North America, because when they came here and they saw this beautiful country, do you think they said, oh, look how pretty the trees are in the valley? Well, I might have figured, you know what, well, I can make a profit out of that. I'm going to make money off of that. And so they cleared the trees, they cleared the Indians, everything else, just for the idea of profit. And they wiped everything out. The difference is that when the Africans came, and others too, to the Americas, they didn't come with that attitude. Let me give you an example. There's a guy whose name, can't remember, I have to look it up. Abu Bakari of Mali in the year 1300 AD. Abu Bakari was this black king. And we know, this is not speculative, folks. This is stuff that is chronicled by the Arabs, not by blacks, by Arabs who visited. In the year 1300 AD, he amassed a fleet of 400 ships. You talk about Columbus with his 3 ships. This guy has a fleet. And he's going